Good morning. Three of us will be giving a presentation on the recently constructed Chateau Road project located just west of Medora. Brief introductions. Again, Adam McGill, he's a project manager with KLJ. Jon Bach, he's the lead designer with KLJ, and myself, I was consultant tech support representing design division of the DOT. I'll begin by giving a project background for the need of the Chateau Road improvement project. In March of 2020, a site in Billings County was selected for the construction of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. The site was chosen based on the proximity of the south unit of the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It was to be located in the Badlands terrain near the historic Western-themed town of Medora. The library site is on the top of a butte near the amphitheater used for the Medora Musical. The site was chosen for the library so it would blend in or complement the rugged terrain and the Badlands and the National Park. In anticipation of the construction and the year 2026 grand opening of the Presidential Library, the DOT was asked to assist with the efforts of improving two roadways near the city of Medora. The roadways include Pacific Avenue and Chateau Road. The first roadway improvement project programmed was Pacific Avenue. Pacific Avenue project includes improvements on the I-94 business loop from exit 24 to 27. The preliminary and construction engineering for the Pacific Avenue project was completed by the consulting firm Civil Science. The improvement project consisted of a mill and overlay, the construction of a roundabout at the intersection of Pacific Avenue and Chateau Road, bridge widening and deck replacement of the Little Missouri Bridge, the addition of shared use paths, and enhanced pedestrian crossings in the urban city section of Medora. The project development timeline for Pacific Avenue began in 2022, was bid in 24. The construction began immediately after it was bid and will be completed in the spring of 26 prior to the opening of the library. The second project in Medora is Chateau Road and began the winter of 2023. In December of 2023, the Billings County submitted a grant application to reconstruct Chateau Road. In February 24, the county was notified that they've been awarded the grant. The engineering services RFP was advertised in April. KLJ was selected to complete the preliminary engineering, was under contract by June 5th of 2024, roughly 6 months after it was initiated by Billings County. Chateau Road is the only point of access to the Medora Musical, Burning Hills Amphitheater, and the site of the Presidential Library. The project is about a mile in length, and the reconstructed road will allow for year-round use for these facilities. There's a number of property owners and stakeholders located on this relatively short reconstruction project. We have a short video to illustrate the location of each. First, we have the adjacent Pacific Avenue project. We have the BNSF railway crossing, it's an at-grade railroad crossing. We have the interpretive center for Chateau de Mours. We have the historic site for Chateau de Mours. The Medora Foundation service road that's used to access the back side of the amphitheater property. A residence that's owned by the Medora Foundation that's housing some of their staff. The Medora Cemetery. Of course, the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library under construction. And then the Medora Foundation Pitchfork Fondue and the Medora Musical Amphitheater. Oops, went too far, sorry. All right, we worked with a number of stakeholders directly involved or impacted by the project. The landowners included BNSF, Cemetery Foundation, Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation, Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, and the State Historical Society of North Dakota. Other stakeholders that had interest in the property, the local ones included the Theodore Roosevelt National Park, City of Medora, Billings County, and they had 3 representatives there for Highway Department, Sheriff's Office, and Emergency Medical Services. Other agencies involved were Fed Highway and SHPO. And the last stakeholders included BNSF. They had an at-grade crossing near the proposed roundabout. And then FRA was involved with the railroad due to the fact that it was classified as a quiet crossing.
All right, good morning here. So I just want to give you kind of a little bit of a feel and perspective on some of the challenges we faced on this project. It was probably one of the more challenging projects that I've done in my career, and even though it's not a very long project, there's just everything was involved on it that you potentially could have on a project. You know, not only is this project directly affecting the Medora Musical, which is obviously a very important venue to all of North Dakota and very famous, and a negative impact from our project to them would be very detrimental in many ways out there. And this was the only entrance in and out there, and so it had a huge impact on them, and we had to mitigate that as much as feasibly possible out there. Also, we have the Presidential Library that's being constructed out there, which is a huge item of national significance that is being constructed out there with with a grand opening on July 4th, 26, but also a potential presidential visit. And so there was no late delivery. There's no tolerance for not having this done on time out here. And so we had a start or an ending date set in stone, but we also had obviously our starting date set in stone on this project, and so we had to do it and deliver it in the time frame possible, and so we had to bring the resources as needed. So this project, to start off the timeline, it was released on April 3rd of 24. We were, about a month and a half later, we were selected as a consultant to bring it about. And then, you know, pretty good time frame actually to be under contract within a couple weeks after that. For June 5th, we can finally start. But, you know, that June 5th date, you know, that's almost halfway through the year already. And so we had to really start running on the project to get this going here. And to accommodate that final grand opening date here, we had to get this project under construction as soon as possible in 2025, and we were already starting halfway through 2024 to try to get this design permitted and everything built in the process here. So that was quite the challenge, and no late deliveries allowed. And obviously we also had to prove up our concept. So we approached this project in the RFP with our philosophy, our idea on how to build the project, what would be buildable out here. And so we had to prove up that concept early in on the design process and come up with a construction schedule with production rates and phasing plan that would allow us to accomplish all the restraints, meet all the restraints on the project, but also accomplish the project for that grand opening date. And so we had to prove up the construction timeline as well as the design timeline on this. There is also a lot of challenges as far as there's significantly historic significance out there. It's not working. There we go. We have the Medora Cemetery, which we obviously cannot impact whatsoever, so that was one constraint we had. And then we also had the Chateau Road State Historic Site, which, as many you might not realize, but that Chateau Road State Historic Site encompasses about 1/3 of Chateau Road, and it's on that site. So any impacts to that Chateau Road site, well, the road was going to impact it no matter what. We also had geological issues out there. This is a view from looking at it from an aerial perspective of just the readily identifiable landslide issues out there, just from an aerial perspective throughout the site. And so we had to navigate whatever option was chosen to move forward with. We had to navigate the geological issues that we would come across. We also had the pitchfork steak fondue up there. That was going to happen before the Medora Musical, and so we had early time constraints as far as noise and dust and other things construction would impact on it. And another wonderful position we were put in, obviously, is there was no alignment established for the project. In the RFP, there was a study done on some alignment opportunities or alternatives to it, which are all of the colored lines that you see here, but the DOT had no preference. They basically came to the consultants and said, okay, tell us what would be the best project to be built here. And so we had to select an alignment and build a case why that would be the best option, why that would be buildable, and prove it up in the RFP process. So it was a big investment for us as we were chasing it. So there were a lot of restrictions. There was no alignment. We had an adjacent cemetery. We had the Chateau de Medora State Historic Site. And you might not know, but this came up during the design, is there was actually no existing right-of-way for Chateau Road on the Chateau de Medora site. So it was there in trespass, and we were designing a project on private state historic land, it was a mess, honestly. We also had noise restrictions because of the musical and the fondue. We had work time restrictions. We had road closure restrictions. We had to maintain two-way traffic at all times going up there. We had unstable geology. And by the way, we also had the railroad crossing to deal with. We had to redo that entire crossing. So, the big question when we approached it was, what in the world were we going to do to accomplish this project? The options A, B, C, D here, we could take whole new alignment, we could come down, either on the north side or on the south side, or have kind of a parallel alignment, or reuse the existing alignment, or something else. The whole ball field was open here on where we wanted to try to hit this thing. So we actually chose the existing alignment as probably the best option with the least unknowns that we could accomplish this project. So with that, looking at option A here, this here is a photo from Pacific Avenue looking up that valley that option A would have gone up. And so we not only would have a new crossing with the BNSF Railroad, which itself would be extremely, extremely difficult, if not impossible, to achieve unless you did a grade separation. But you have this undisturbed valley that we would have to cut a roadway into going up there. And who knows what geologic and what cultural items we would encounter while constructing this site up here and while designing it. So we did not really feel this was a very viable option. And in addition to that, the Presidential Library was right at the top of the hill of this valley, and it took advantage of the view down that valley. And so us cutting a scar for an entry point going up the valley there, right where they're taking a panorama towards the national park, was really just not fit with the master plan for the site here. So we ruled out option A as something that we thought would be achievable up there. Option B, going down on the south side here, that again was going to be something we felt was not really achievable. The top picture here is a view from the fondue, and you'd be able to see the entry road cutting across the landscape right from the fondue in one of the biggest views and panoramas of the project. And that also would be visible from the seating at the Medora Musical. And so if you imagine being there in the evening, it's getting dark out, the musical is playing, and all of a sudden you see headlights catch the corner of your eye driving up, it would really hinder the wonderfulness that we all enjoy with the Medora Musical out there. And so it just was going to be fatal to that natural atmosphere that you have out there. We took that off of the options. There was also some parallel alignment options, option C here, which I won't go into the details on that. John's going to actually elaborate a little bit more on what his thought process was on why we could and could not go with those options. And so we were left really with option alignment D, the existing alignment, or as close to it as possible to achieve the project that was buildable in the time frame we have and had the least unknowns along the project. So I wanted to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the Chateau de Mours site here. So since the entire Chateau de Mours site encompasses, about 1/3 of the roadway, goes all the way up the hillside there, we have no right-of-way to build the roadway within here. That was a problem here. We can't even bid a project if we don't have the right-of-way for this. And any impact to the Chateau de Mours site was an impact to a site of state historic significance. And that would be automatically a 4F de minimis impact to the project. And so we had to do a de minimis process out here to prove up that we were minimizing the impacts to the site. And in order to minimize impacts to the site, we had to do some here's a view of what that looks from an aerial perspective on what was included within the chateau site here. You can see there's the big bluff, the roadway, and we had to widen the roadway going to the right side here because we had a deep valley and the visitor center on the left. And so we had to cut into this big hillside here, but we still had to minimize impacts. And so we had to do drilling, geotechnical borings on that hillside to know what kind of slope we could slope it back to, what would be achievable while still minimizing the impacts out there. And so, but the conundrum with that was to do those geotechnical borings, it would itself be an impact to the site. And so we had to do an additional CADX just to clear us to do our geotechnical investigation so we could do the de minimis process to finish up the CADX process for the whole project out here. And so it was a kind of a circular process that we had to work through to actually gain access to prove up our alignment, to do everything we needed to complete the design and the environmental permitting. And we were finally able to get that CADX by definition by October 17th of 24. But again, that's getting late in the season here and we're running out of time to build the project. What it ended up looking like, this is a picture towards the end of 25 when the whole roadway on the lower side was built and we have all that sloping done. You can see the difference of how much earth we had to move out of there. It was pretty significant, and so quite a bit of impact. And so the 4F de minimis process was a really lengthy process we had to go through, kind of challenging. That's the first time I had done it personally. But initially when we did that 4F de minimis, we had to bring it to the North Dakota Department of Transportation. Their environmental staff had to approve it. From there, we had to submit it to the State Historic Society of North Dakota, who were the owners of the process, of the site here, the Chateau de Mours, and get them to review it and approve it. And from there, it would go to SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, for them to review and approve. Once we got their approval, we would then go to the FHWA, Federal Highway Administration, to get their approval. And if at any point in time somebody had comments on the process or on the document or what we're doing, we had to basically start over in the process and get approval from each entity again before going on to the final entity to get that approval. But we were able to achieve that FHWA approval by April 22nd of 2025. So you notice that's spring of 2025. That's quite late in the process here, but it took a long time to get to there. Another challenge we had is as we're getting into the design of this, it became very apparent very early on that we weren't going to have a bid-ready project. We wouldn't have a contractor on board to start tree clearing for northern long-eared bat before the clearing window would be enacted and we couldn't clear anymore. And so in order to allow the project to continue or to start on a good foot, we had to actually get out there and remove all the trees that were going to be impacted before construction, before we had the main contractor on board. And so we had to do a mini standalone project, bring that to bid during the winter of 24-25 just to do the tree clearing out there, which we were able to accomplish and get completely cleared by January 30th of 2025. So there's just so many little steps and little things we had to predict to get this moving along. So to take that all together here and look at the timeline, in 2024 was when the process started for KLJ. Like the RFP came out in April of 2024. We were selected in May, we got a contract in June, and then we had to rock and roll on getting the the design going, get the field investigations going, get everything moving here. We moved into our railroad coordination toward the early fall of '24, and we were able to get our CADX by definition for the soil borings so we could continue and understand what we were allowed to slope the roadway embankment to, and that would prove up our alignment process. We had to get the tree removal going here in December, and then going into 2025, you know, the timeline's ticking here, and we were able to get that tree removal completed in January, by the end of January there, and we also were able to get the initial CADX approved by the end of January, but that initial CADX approval was kind of, it was de facto approval. We weren't completely done with the de minimis process at this, and so we got an approval expecting to have to do an addendum later on. And so, you know, with that January 31st CADX, we moved on to finalizing our plans 2 weeks later. So we were progressing the plans as best we could, as fast as we could, to have those ready for final, bid ready final, right after the CADX was done, and that happened in February, and then bid ready, got everything signed and approved by the end of February. And at this point, we're still working through the de minimis process, trying to get these approvals, and timeline is ticking, and we're getting a lot of pressure here. We're approaching the bid date on it, and so we were able to get that de minimis, the 4F de minimis process finally approved by April 22nd of 2025, and that allowed us to buy the right-of-way. So we actually now had the land we could actually build the roadway on. And so we recorded the plats, had it all done and put together, so we owned the land right after the de minimis process, so that after we had that done, we had to immediately do our CADX by definition. We had just a couple days to get that approved for an April 25th addendum to be approved, so that we could actually even do the bid opening by April 25th. So it was just bang, bang, bang at the end here to try to get this done and keep all the balls rolling to get this project accomplished, because we had no flexibility to be late on it. It was a very interesting process to go through, and it had a lot of challenges, but actually it was really fun and rewarding that we were able to bring it to a successful completion on the design side. And so far, I think that it's been going pretty well on the construction side. I know Kevin was going to heckle me a little bit about the project. I don't know if he's in here, Kevin Clapper. But I think it's been going pretty well and moving along. With that, I'll turn it over to Jon here to kind of talk about the design.
All right, thanks, Adam. Now, I'll take us home in this presentation with a focus on the project design. It's what all the engineers in the room want to hear about, the typical sections, the alignments, everything that goes into the project design itself. So to start with, get this forward, there we go. We got to redefine the project limits. We got to discuss and confirm where we started from. So the project originally began at the top of the hill at the parking lot, at the entrance, and projected down the hill to the intersection of Pacific Avenue. Now, that was the original limits. Halfway through the project, we did add an extension within the parking lot itself that involved maybe a total mile, a little over a mile when we were all said and done. Now, something unique about this corridor, there's over 232 feet of elevation rise from start to end on this alignment. Now, that's only a mile. That's pretty substantial for North Dakota. And the existing profile grade was different. It wasn't a consistent slope. The green areas were less than 8%. The yellow areas, let's get the slide to move forward here. They were 8 to 12%. And then the reds were the steepest at 12 to 15%. So of course, as Adam and Chad mentioned earlier, we did not have a defined alignment. We did not have a defined typical section. So we needed to analyze alternatives based upon project goals. And I'll summarize some of those goals here. We had to define our project schedule. We had a short time frame, not only for design, but for construction. It needed to be buildable. We needed to have a desire to flatten our roadway profile grade. I mentioned the 15%. We didn't want to hold those. We wanted to increase the horizontal curve radii if we could, or match what was there at a minimum. We wanted to increase the road capacity by increasing its width. There was a desire to preserve the landscape. This is a special place in North Dakota. We didn't want to put scarps in the slopes just because. And there was also some ridgeline ordinances. Imagine a bunch of headlights protruding into the national park across the road. That wasn't a desirable goal. We also wanted to add pedestrians, accommodations, shared use paths, things like that. And of course, construction costs. We had to be cognizant of that as we were looking through our options. So what did we start with? Existing Chateau Road had two 12-foot lanes and shoulders, and it was concrete pavement. That's what we started with. When we first laid out some proposed typicals for discussion, these were the two that we threw out. We started with two kind of very different situations. One was a standard ditch section, and the bottom there had a curb and gutter section. Those were the two differences between them, but ultimately they had a lot of similarities. There was two through lanes, one in each direction, and then there was a shared middle lane. That middle lane was implemented to accommodate two things. One was emergency service access. When there's a lot of queuing of vehicles on this road going up or down the hill, it's difficult for emergency services to access the site. One way in, one way out. So that third lane in the middle was there to utilize for the emergency services if needed. It also helped with off-tracking. A lot of large vehicles, these are tight radii. Whether it's a camper, a semi-trailer, the extra lane helped with off-tracking. Now, the alignment was the next thing we had to lay out. We knew we had restrictions. The yellow areas were items we needed to avoid. We needed to avoid the interpretive center, some steep slopes, the residence, the Medora Cemetery, and additional steep slopes adjacent to the existing parking lot. So we started with laying out a couple of alignment options for the field review. The yellow line represents the existing alignment, and then the colored alignments were the three options we threw together for the field review to coordinate with stakeholders and to get the conversation moving. Now, ultimately, the blue alignment, we'll call it 10A, that was a 10% max profile grade. And the call out where it's pointing to, that notes where the proposed alignment crossed the existing alignment. So in this case, we expanded on the east side, and then we crossed just south of the residence, and then we stayed on the south side the rest of the way. The red alignment also had a 10% max profile grade, but in this case, we crossed at the service road towards the bottom of the hill, and we stayed on the west side through the majority of the rise up the slope. And then we, of course, wanted to identify a flatter grade profile option. That happened to be our orange alignment, which was an 8% profile grade. Now, looking at it, it doesn't look very great. Ultimately, when you have your start and end stops fixed, the elevations were fixed, the only way to flatten your profile is to have a longer road. So this was an illustration and just something we wanted to throw out there to show people what it would take to get to something at 8%. So we started analyzing each of these alternatives in relation to those project goals. So in this case, the blue alignment, we did flatten the profile grade. This ended up having about 2,000 feet at 10%, but it did not increase the horizontal curves. We had the horseshoe up on the top of the hill got tighter, which wasn't ideal. It also didn't preserve the existing landscape. In that same horseshoe area, we were cutting into those slopes quite significantly. And then in this case, because of where the roadway was expanded or widened on each side, the earthwork balance was very poor. We had a lot of excess waste with this alignment. The red alignment is comparable to the blue, except that crossing location changed. So we migrated the road onto the west side or to the left side of the screen, but we were still able to flatten the profile grade, again, 2,000 feet at 10%. It was a little better with the horizontal curves, but still not ideal. Preservation of landscape was a little better, but we still had a significant amount of impacts in that horseshoe area, but earthwork balance was better. Then the orange, of course, that was the best for flattening that profile grade. It was really poor for increasing the horizontal curves. In fact, it increased the number of horizontal curves. And then preservation of landscape was poor as well, because this was all on virgin ground. And then earthwork balance was fair. Then we had our field review, we met with stakeholders, had numerous coordination efforts, and we formulated kind of an optimized alignment that ended up being our build alternative. This had a 9.5% max profile grade, and it's very comparable to the red alignment, except it did add one additional crossing of the existing road, and that was just south of the cemetery. So not only did it cross the existing road at the service road, it went up the hill and crossed one additional time. That allowed us to flatten the profile grade even more. It lengthened the roadway length. It increased the horizontal curves or matched the existing curvature. It did have a much better job of preserving the landscape, and the earthwork balance was much better. And in this case, the length of the max profile grade was only 1,500 feet at 9.5%. The rest of it was 7.2% or flatter. Next was typical section. We had many coordination efforts with stakeholders to determine what the build selection was. I'll highlight a few things with it here. Starting with that existing center line, just to highlight the shift. Not only was it a shift, but there was a significant vertical difference between the existing and the proposed alignments as well. So then the proposed alignment would be on the right side in the green. Now, what did we do for lane assignments? Those 2 through lanes, 1 in each direction, were held, and then the 12-foot median in the middle was also held from the preliminary alternatives, again, for emergency services and off-tracking purposes. The material selection for the pavement was 8 inches of concrete on 8 inches of base, and we also had a 10-foot wide shared use path implemented on one side of the road that also was concrete with aggregate base, and then a 6-foot grass boulevard in the middle. And notice there's no curb and gutter on here. That was not selected. We went with a standard ditch section. Next was pedestrian facilities. We had to implement those. Starts with knowing what we had to tie into. So at the Pacific Avenue project, there was a shared use path that we knew we needed to tie into. That happened to be on the southeast quadrant of that intersection. There was a desire to have pedestrians navigate directly to the interpretive center, as well as the ability to get to the historic site. We wanted to preserve that landscape. We didn't want to put scarps in those hills just because. So that was a factor in the pedestrian location also. And the library, we needed to tie to their sidewalk at the top of the hill, which was on the north side of the parking lot. So this was the end result of where the shared use path ended up, kind of the pink outline in this graphic. So starting at the bottom of the hill, and then we'll work our way up, we're on the south side or the east side of Chateau Road. That allowed people to get directly to the interpretive center and to the historic site. Then we added a raised crosswalk so that people could get across the road. And then with the shared use path was on the east side or the north side of Chateau Road the rest of the way. That allowed us to preserve that landscape as much as possible, and it assisted with our dirt balance as well. Now we get to the top of the hill, and we also needed to add 1 additional raised crosswalk so that pedestrians could access safely to the Pitchfork Steak Fondue and to the Medora Musical. Now, I mentioned a couple raised crosswalks. Ultimately, what those looked like is what you see here, little bumps, if you will, in the corridor. You see those in residential neighborhoods and amongst municipalities. But ultimately, we wanted to have a physical representation for the traveling public and vehicular traffic of, hey, there's a crosswalk here. We put street lights in, we put these raised crosswalks in, extra pavement marking, followed all the MUTCD requirements just to make it a little safer for everybody. Next, we're going to touch on geotechnical a little bit. There were 2 key features we implemented into the final design, and Shannon and Wilson was the engineer of record for that, and they helped us through this process. So starting with the settlement area, we had an area that was identified as it had a highly likelihood of settlement. So anytime we had a proposed fill greater than 5 feet, we wanted to take into account and monitor that with settlement plates. So it was 425 feet in length, and there were 7 settlement plates installed, and those settlements were monitored throughout construction. Next, we had sinkhole repairs. There were 3 locations that literally had existing voids. You could probably use them as a slide if somebody really wanted to. The end result was we wanted to fill them. We didn't want them to stay in place. So we used controlled density backfill. We put material in them to fill them up, and we capped them with dirt. Now we're going to dive into some traffic control and phasing. This topic is a big one for the corridor, and it starts with understanding what our constraints were. So number 1, we had to accommodate concurrent adjacent projects. So what does that mean on this corridor? Well, starting with the Presidential Library, it was an active construction zone. There were material deliveries coming in with big, large semi-trailers. There was a lot of laborers coming in and out every day. We needed to maintain access for them at all times. We had no choice. We could not shut it down. Pacific Avenue was on the south side. That was an active construction project with an already selected contractor, an established phasing plan, and schedule. So our phasing had to accommodate and match into theirs to maintain traffic. And then finally, we had the Burning Hills Amphitheater and the Medora Musical parking lot. That was, portions of that were being reconstructed in order to tie into our project. And we worked with another engineering team to work through elevations, grades, storm sewer design. So that was an active design project and construction at the same time. We also had the construction schedule. What we designed had to be built. It had to be constructible within the time frame we had. We also had the Medora Musical performance schedule. The musical had to go on. There were restrictions. So when the performance was occurring, or the pitch fix or the steak fondue was active and people were driving up the slope to get to the performance, there were certain areas the contractor was not allowed to work in past 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So not only did we have a tight and reduced construction schedule, there also was a reduced amount of hours in the day that they could work. And then finally, maintaining access. This is 1 road in, 1 road out. We had to maintain access at all times. So the phasing plan ended up, we broke the project into 7 total segments. It had 7 construction phases, 2 years of construction, but that really means 1 full year plus a few months. And then year 1 had phases 1 through 4, and year 2 had phases 5 through 7. Now, I got a lot of colors on this screen. I'll do my best to explain what they are. But ultimately, what you're looking at is year 1, phase 1. The green areas represented proposed permanent grading or proposed permanent pavement. The yellow areas were temporary grading or temporary bypasses, temporary pavement. And then there's kind of some light red colors. Those represented the existing pavement that was available during this phase, and then how traffic's being maintained. So in this case, traffic's on the existing road system. We're building off of this. So we're building a lot of bypasses in preparation for the next phase. Starting with the Chateau des Morts bypass, we needed access to that historic site. We built a bypass that allowed people to travel from the existing to the proposed pavement in preparation for the next phase. This is that settlement area where we put temporary asphalt down. Then we had a bypass or an access to the residents. We had an additional bypass that allowed people to get from the proposed pavement to the existing. Then we had the cemetery bypass. And then lastly was a parking lot bypass, which actually was one of the first things implemented in order to get traffic diverted into the parking lot at an alternate entrance so we could start working on Chateau Road at the parking lot. So from a typical section perspective, I want to explain that temporary grading a little bit. The yellow area is the temporary grading. The green here would be the permanent grading. Now, we could have pushed this alignment farther away and rebuilt the whole thing in one shot, but ultimately our dirt balance would have been excessive. We would have had a lot of excess dirt, and the preservation of landscape wouldn't have been accomplished. So we did this in phases. Now we're in year 1, phase 2, and ultimately we're working on more reconstruction work of Chateau Road, and we're using a combination of existing and proposed pavement to navigate people through the work zone. So we're going to start at the roundabout and work our way up the hill. So first they hit a lane shift. They're on existing pavement, then they migrate to parts of the proposed pavement we built, implement the bypass if people want to use that to get to the historic site. Then we have an additional lane shift to get them back on existing. Then we have a bypass to get people from the existing to the proposed pavement we just built in the previous phase. People will drive through that settlement area. Then a bypass for the residents. Then we have yet another bypass to get people from the proposed to the existing pavement. Then they can finally use that parking lot bypass and get to the musical or get to the library. And if somebody did need to get to the cemetery, we had access there through that bypass also. So from a typical section, we're finishing out that. Previously, the area underneath the green, that was the temporary grading. We put people onto the new pavement, and now we're finishing out the embankment, and we're removing the existing road. Now we're into phase 3. Ultimately, what's going on here is we're replacing that temp grading with permanent grading, removing some bypasses, except for one area which we haven't touched yet, and that's in what we called segment F, which is adjacent to Pacific Avenue. This area had the railroad crossing with BNSF. Through coordination with them, we were not permitted to do one of two things. We were not able to widen the existing crossing, and we also were not able to implement a temporary crossing. We had to use what was there. So we were left with no choice. To do concrete pavement, we had to do 24-hour flagging. Once cure time was achieved, we were able to keep traffic moving, but this required 24-hour flagging until cure was attained. And we had a lane shift to get people onto the proposed pavement, and they drove the proposed pavement the rest of the way up. Now we're in year 1, phase 4. Ultimately, we're working on the other side of the road at the railroad crossing to get that reconstructed and a little sidewalk. So now we're into year 2. Now, some of this work has not been completed yet. This would be work that's going to be performed yet this year. Starting at the settlement area, we have to convert that from temporary asphalt to permanent concrete. So we'll have to implement a few lane shifts, get traffic migrated, and install that concrete pavement. Then, of course, we have to do the other side. We have to do another lane shift, get traffic moved over, work on reconstructing the permanent concrete pavement and the rest of the shared use path. And then lastly, there will be a little bit of a raised median work in order to connect the Pacific Avenue to the Chateau Road project. There was a portion of that median that had to be left out in order to migrate traffic back and forth with the phasing plans. And when everything's caught up with each other, we can close those out. All right, traffic control was a doozy. It was a fun puzzle, but now I'm going to migrate into some right-of-way conversations. So Adam mentioned before, no public recorded right-of-way along Chateau Road. There were some more questions we had to ask ourselves. Who is the grantee? Who is the grantor? Is it the DOT? Is it Billings County? Is it Medora Musical? Is it the State Historical Society? Who is it? Well, ultimately, the ownership turned out this way. The DOT is the owner of the construction project. Billings County is the grantee on the right-of-way plats. Billings County is the owner after construction is complete. And then there were a couple maintenance agreements put in place with multiple parties, including Billings County, Teddy Roosevelt Medora Foundation, and the Presidential Library to determine maintenance responsibilities of Chateau Road, not only for snow plowing, but for pavement remedies down the road 20 years from now. So 5 total plats, 17 parcels, 3 landowners, 15 acres of permanent road easement, and 18 acres of temp easement. Now, if anybody wants some good bedtime reading to go to sleep, that graphic on the right, that's 1 parcel. You could have fun reading that legal description. It'll put you to sleep pretty fast. Utility coordination was a very prominent, critical path on our schedule for design. A lot of numbers here, but I'll highlight one. The road was about 1 mile in length. The length of proposed resolutions in total was 2.3 miles, so over double the corridor length we had in proposed utility resolutions. So to summarize the utility encounter side of this design effort, I'll summarize it with some of the challenges we faced and overcame. Number 1 was the design schedule. Everyone who's done utility coordination understands it takes time. It takes effort to coordinate with them. It takes time to get permits in place, and it's just an effort. But we had concurrent design projects running at the same time. So when we first started meeting with some of these utilities, they were already had boots on the ground relocating utilities in preparation to upsize their lines for the library foundation. Well, we quickly discovered that where they were putting them, we were going to impact 3 to 4 months later. So we actually had to ask them to kind of stop work and renegotiate with us because we were the last design project to the table. So once we got in touch with them, we were able to coordinate our efforts, but we had to get through that first initial phase of let's stop and let's rethink this. The State Historical Society had water lines that we were impacting, and they did not have an engineer or a firm on staff or a desired preference of who could do that work. So KLJ took that on, and we made that part of the actual construction contract to relocate those water lines. A lot of utilities were upsizing their facilities, so when it came to reimbursable costs, we couldn't just go off of the materials they were going to put in the ground. We had to ask and confirm what the existing utility capacity was, so our reimbursable rates were based upon the existing lines, not their upsizing for the new lines. There were many utility easements and permits that were needed. One of the landowners was the State Historical Society. Those new utility easements had to go all the way up to the North Dakota Governor's office for signature. That takes time. So ultimately what that means is we really, really needed to expedite our final design, even faster than we initially thought. So there was time to get the utility agreements in place, get our special provisions in place, get those permits allocated and signed, go through the process. We couldn't just, it wasn't 2 days, it was months. We had to expedite that design early. So I'll summarize, kind of close out the presentation with a few additional design challenges that we had. We've talked about many of them already. We had concurrent adjacent projects. Some were active in construction with established phasing plans. Some were still in design. We had to work with all 3 parties. We were sandwiched between 3 total projects to make ours work. The project schedule was tight, not only for design, but for construction. There was numerous stakeholder coordination meetings. There was a big effort at the beginning in order to get buy-in, get feedback, understand what people needed, what they desired, and to formulate decisions. The utility coordination expedited our final design efforts even more than we initially anticipated, and we needed to execute that fast. The construction phasing, that was a fun puzzle to identify and figure out. It was a challenge to overcome. And lastly, the parking lot expansion. That was something that was added about halfway through the project, so not only did we have these challenges, we had to restart some of them. We had to restart the project schedule, reanalyze the stakeholder coordination, redo the utility coordination, modify our construction phasing to accommodate that extension. So where are we today? What's the current status? The project, year 1 is complete. That would be about 84% of the total construction dollars have been allocated. Year 2 is upcoming. 16% of that contract is left, and with a completion date of June 12th of this year. And of course, the Teddy Roosevelt Presidential Library, the grand opening is scheduled for Independence Day of 2026. So to close us out, I've got a video at the end that kind of has drone footage that was flown in November of 2025. And there's going to be some call-outs on it. If it's a blue call-out, what that represents is material or work that was performed after the video was collected, or it's highlighting a feature that was constructed in 25. If it's an orange call-out, it's something that is yet to be completed, meaning it's going to be done in year 2 of construction. So that's where the Pacific Avenue roundabout was as of November. That was the 24-hour flagging area, and in 26 we've got some shared use path and grade crossing panels to do at the shared use path. There will be significant landscape planting effort put in force for 2026 just to beautify the corridor. That's our raised crosswalk at the lower part of the hill. And in this video, the contractor is working on the service road, which had an additional time restriction. The contractor could not access that until after the musical was closed for the season. There's the temporary asphalt for the settlement area. And as we progress up the hill, you can kind of see some of the bypasses at work, which is kind of a neat factor of this video. In 25, that bypass was removed late in the season, but that's the bypass that was used to migrate proposed pavement to existing pavement. There's a temporary bypass for the cemetery that was removed, some shared use path, and a seating area that was installed. And that would be the existing Chateau Road pavement that was also removed late in the season. And then finally, there's the parking lot bypass that also was removed late in the season. And I mentioned a seating area just a few seconds ago. Here's one of them that's completed on the right side, upcoming. Think of it as a picnic table seating area that could be used for families for a leisure area. There's the raised crosswalk that's going to be used to enter into the Pitchfork Steak Fondue. And the parking lot reconstruction at the Medora Musical is active at this time, and I believe there's still some work yet to be done there in 26. And we're nearing the end of Chateau Road right there, and then the library is in the background being worked on actively also. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. That's the end of our presentation. Now, I just want to thank everybody who has worked on this project. There's some people in the room I know have worked on this, whether it's construction, whether it's environmental, design. There's been a lot of effort put into place to make this project a fruition, and we will reach our goal of getting it done before the Presidential Library grand opening. Thank you.